Back. I cheated. I looked it up online. Don't tell anyone. Okay. The Castle of Udolpho was by Horace Walpole, and The Mysteries of Udolpho is by Anne Radcliffe. Anyway, this is the Gothic. And this is the type of literature, again, which Wordsworth sees as suited to people who have become enervated and are no longer able to be satisfied to take pleasure from normal human life. And so they need to read about monsters, or they need to read about ghosts or things like that, because anything less than a thriller is insufficient to hold their attention and to give them pleasure. I won't go into it too much, but there's another genre of literature that's also very popular at this particular time, and that's pornography. And Wordsworth, again, is not going, he won't even mention it, but he definitely has that in mind. There's a growing number of people, especially in the cities, who are unable to, again, experience pleasure from just reading stories that talk about healthy human relationships. They need to read about the extremes of human experience. And so, yeah, there's a big market for that type of literature as well. And this is exactly, whether it be the effete artificial literature, whether it be the thrillers, or whether it be the pornography, all of this is indicative of, again, a culture with depraved tastes. And so he's going to try to create a new type of a literature that shows what healthy human relationships look like, that shows what healthy human feelings look like, and that will serve as a litmus test to see who actually is in their right mind, who's still possessed of their senses, and who isn't. So that's really what's going on here. He talks about poems having a worthy purpose. It could sound like what he means is there ought to be a moral to all of these stories, and I don't think that's what he has in mind. A worthy purpose means simply to capture the reader's attention, to capture the reader's imagination, and to help them have some type of a vicarious but nevertheless powerful emotional experience. Again, a moral sentiment that you should be able to read a poem and feel actual empathy for the characters who are being described in it. That's what a worthy purpose is. And beyond that, Wordsworth would say we're already going beyond the necessary and running the risk of getting ourselves into trouble both literarily and emotionally, because we're beginning to indulge in the use of stimulants of one sort or another, which simply aren't good for the body or the mind. So what is going to, what will reading a poem like this supposedly do? Wordsworth talks about poetry as being the product of spontaneous emotions overflowing in a powerful way. So a poem should do what? It should tug at your heartstrings in one way or another, so that you feel for the character. And as you read the poetry, a sense of your own human nature is going to well up in you. And for Wordsworth, this is, healthy, and it's the type of thing that we should want for ourselves. But it's not going to be the result of any type of decoding of artificial messages. It's simply going to be reading the text and being able to relate to it. So even though I don't like to use the word, you guys will use the word relatable, and that's kind of what he's suggesting here. The key then to this type of poetry is going to be twofold. The first is going to entail the type of language which is used, and the second is the type of events, the type of characters which the poetry is going to describe. So the first thing Wordsworth is going to say is the language needs to be the common language of everyday people, unadorned with all kinds of artificial techniques which nobody uses in real life. And he's going to say, where do you find this type of language? Generally, it's going to be from out of the mouths of rural people. So this is really, really important because prior to this, if literature was to be taken seriously, if it was to be perceived as genuine art, then one of the things that it had to do was, if not use all kinds of allegorical figures, it had to write about noble characters doing great deeds. We needed heroes. We needed people who were larger than life and who behaved in spectacular fashion, accomplishing mighty deeds or coming to catastrophic ends, which, might have cut their life short, but they would have died in glory. Wordsworth's like, no, that's not how people live. We don't want superheroes. We want natural humans in a natural setting. And where do you find that? You find that in country folk. You're not going to find it in the cities because people have become depraved there. You're not going to find it at Oxford and Cambridge. You're going to find it out in the highlands or in the Lake District or somewhere like that. Some area that is still populated by what? People whose lives have not been made artificial either through the university system or through the factory system. So you're going to talk about what? Shepherds, farmers, bricklayers, potters, stone cutters. These are people whose jobs keep them tied to the natural environment, keep them tied to other people, and which, rather than crush their human nature, their jobs actually express their human nature. And their speech, because it hasn't been rendered artificial, is going to, yes, employ figures of speech, tropes, but they're going to be tropes that come out of our mouths spontaneously. We speak in metaphors all the time. It's hard not to speak in metaphors. Whether you talk about having a splitting headache, well, your head's not literally coming in two, I should hope, but talking about it as if that were the case is a way to get your point across. If you want to say I was hungry as a wolf, that's a metaphor too. It's an inescapable part of our language, but in people living simple rural lives, as far as Wordsworth is concerned, these metaphors arise spontaneously. They are not deliberately crafted, and therefore they're going to be, and this comes from Rousseau's thinking, they're going to be expressive of real emotions occasioned by real life events, and not the type of thing that someone learns out of a book. So he says we should speak, the poet should speak as a man speaking to men, and this is what he's getting at. The poetry should be very, very simple. But what he suggests is that if you're healthy, if you've got your head on right, if you haven't been contaminated either by the cities or by capitalism or by the factories or by the universities, you should be able to read simple stories about plain country folk and find pleasure in them as they elicit our natural sympathies. So that's really what he's getting at in all of this. So where's he getting his ideas from? Well, he mentions Aristotle in here. Aristotle, as we'll see later in the semester, writes a famous book called The Poetics, and it's about how tragedy should work. He'll talk about all the different components that go into making up a tragedy, types of characters, types of plots, and all of that. And what Aristotle recommends, not in the Poetics, but in his moral and ethical philosophy, is that the best way to live is in moderation. One should not deviate from the middle course. And I think it's this kind of logic which is leading Wordsworth to take a moderate view regarding poetry. It should not be overly ornamental, but it should not be under ornamental. It should not be too sensational, but it should not be devoid of feeling either. So he's getting this from Aristotle's Poetics, I think, though in one way he'll deviate from Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle says that the protagonist of any drama needs to be somebody who's better than us. Essentially what he's getting at is they need to be an aristocrat, and I'll not explain why that's the case. But for Wordsworth, no, it's actually country people, the type of people who would have been ridiculed in Greek comedy. For Wordsworth, those people, as a matter of fact, are the ones who make the best protagonists for the type of poetry that Wordsworth is talking about. And just for the record, again, that the name of this book of poetry is called Lyrical Ballads. Lyric refers to singing, and ballads is going to be what? That type of song or that type of poem which actually tells a story. So these are, as it were, stories set to music, and again, about simple people like farmers. And this is really interesting because another source of Wordsworth's ideas is something that's called the Homeric question. If you were an IT one with me, we'd get into this at some length. I'll just mention it in passing here. But the Homeric question has to do with the identity of the person who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And traditionally, the idea was that Homer was this blind bard, that he wrote poetry by inspiration. The very fact that he was physically blind only meant that he had a higher vision that the rest of us didn't possess, and that allowed him to sing about the rage of Achilles or about the exploits of Odysseus. Homer was thought to be then inspired. He was thought to be noble, as were all of the people about whom he wrote. Starting, though, in the Renaissance, people start to wonder if this view of Homer isn't actually incorrect. And they begin to look at inconsistencies in the text and start to realize that, maybe this guy's not so inspired. He's making all kinds of errors. As we get into the 1700s, it starts to become a question as to whether Homer was actually all that noble, and whether the characters he writes about were all that noble. So, we think about Odysseus or Creon, or not Creon, we think about Menelaus or Agamemnon as great and lofty kings living in fabulous palaces and all of that. And, what certain people recognize is, well, if he's so high and mighty and living in such a glorious palace, why is there a dung heap right next to his front door? People start to realize that whoever wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and this is a long, involved conversation I won't get into, but the simple thing is Homer actually may have been far more primitive than anybody had ever imagined. Homer was not glorious. The archaic Greeks were not glorious and larger-than-life figures living in palaces, but they were living in huts, or they were living in very simple dwellings, just like rural people in Wordsworth's day. So What Wordsworth is trying to suggest is that people have created a completely inaccurate vision or understanding of who Homer was, and consequently, they're trying to read his poetry as if it came from somebody who never was. And so he doesn't dismiss the poetry of Homer, but he's going to say that, quite frankly, we've got it all wrong. One of the reasons is the most famous translation of Homer that was available at the time was done either by an Elizabethan named Chapman, or also there was a figure from the Restoration and the early English Enlightenment called Alexander Pope, and they produced these incredibly ornamental, flowery, and to Wordsworth's mind, inaccurate travesties of the original Iliad. If you were to read the Iliad in the original Greek, it would look nothing the way that English readers had come to see it, because they'd ornamented the hell out of it. It wasn't the same Homer anymore. So Wordsworth is wanting to see Homer as a humble, simple, rustic type, as were all the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And as we begin to see that Homer is actually more interesting and more moving if we see him as the humble peasant that he probably was, this changes our idea. Homer wasn't a bard in the sense of being some supernatural seer. He was a bard simply because he did what? He sang poetry while playing his lyre. That's all he was. And this is all that Wordsworth says poets ought to be now. Men speaking to men in the language of the common people. And if the great bard Homer was no supernatural superhero, then what about the English bard? And who do we have in mind here? Yeah, Shakespeare. We refer to him still sometimes as the Bard of Avon. What had happened is over the years, people had come to see Shakespeare as somehow being heroic, larger than life, and somehow superior to other people. And Wordsworth wants to say, no, you've got Shakespeare all wrong too. He wasn't some divinely gifted visionary. He was what then? A poet like any other genuine poet, and that's going to be a man speaking to men in such a way that it moves their hearts without the need for all kinds of artificial tropology, all kinds of fancy language. And if you see Shakespeare in that fashion, reading his plays becomes something very, very different. We're not looking for hidden meanings in them. What we're looking for is characters with whom we can identify and whose lives, in one way or another, touch our hearts. Beyond that, there's nothing as far as Wordsworth is concerned. So the test, can you feel something when you read a poet, comes down to, as I said earlier, have you or have you not been contaminated or perverted by all kinds of cultural systems and ingrained habits that now render you senseless or insensible. So that's a really interesting thing. He says the poet, what makes a poet different from other people? The fact that they have a little bit better memories, that they tend to be a little bit more sensitive to poignant scenes in everyday life, and that they're able to do what? In moments of quiet reflection and recollection, they can conjure up these memories, these sensations and then do what? Transfer them to a page. But he's very clear. The difference between a poet and a typical person is quantitative. It's quantitative, not qualitative. They have a little bit more of the sensitivity than the rest of us. They have a little bit more powerful memory than the rest of us, and they have a little bit more of an ability to conjure up emotions in moments of quiet reflection. But that's it. There's no special gift. And this is going to be one of the things that makes him very different from Coleridge's theory of poetry. So I'm going to take a break right now, and then I'll come back and talk to you about Coleridge.